We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Beizam and Beizam Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 12b. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing whether avodim, whether slaves, are considered like karka or are they considered like metaltalin. And the Gemara said that there's a contradiction because one brisa says that if you make a chazak on karka, you can be kona the avodim, and the other brisa says that if you make a chazak on karka, that kinyan chazak on the karka can't create a kinyan on the avodim. And so the Gemara said it makes sense to say that we can make a distinction in terms of the brisas whether the evid is on the karka or not on the karka. If the evid is on that piece of karka, then the kinyan will work, and if the evid is not on the piece of karka, the kinyan will not work. But the Gemara said that distinction only makes sense if you're going to say that avodim are considered to be metaltalin. So then we'll say it makes a difference whether the avodim are on the karka or not. But if the avodim are considered to be land, such a distinction does not make sense, because the halacha is you can make a chazaka on a piece of land, and that chazaka can work for other pieces of land that, of course, are not on that same first piece of land. But then the Gemara asks, but even if an evid is metaltalin, why would we make a distinction in terms of whether the evid is on the property or not? That should be a kinyan, what we call a kinyan agav, and that works hakaimalon, we've established, the lo ba'in and siborin, that you don't need the metaltalin to be gathered onto that piece of property. And so therefore, even if you're going to say that avodim are metaltalin, it should not make a difference whether the avodim are on the karka or not. So we're really back to the contradiction. Why is the contradiction any better resolved if avodim are considered like metaltalin rather than karka? In both situations, we really should not make a distinction whether the evid is on the property or not on the property. And so the Gemara says, so what are you going to have to say? Even if you say avodim are metaltalin, you're going to have to say the following. You're going to have to say shani metaltali denaidi, mi metaltali delo naidi, that movable objects, metaltalin, that are moving, that are able to move on their own, they're different than metaltalin that are not able to move. Meaning to say, when it comes to avodim where the evid is able to walk, the evid is able to move, so there the evid has to actually be on that piece of karka in order for the kinyan to work. Other metaltalin, that would not be true. And that's what you'll say in order to answer the contradiction in the brisa. Again, the brisa that said the kinyan works is talking about where the evid is on the karka. The other one is talking about where the evid is not on the karka. But once you're already saying that, the Gemara says hachinami. But why not say the same thing when it comes to saying that avodim are like karka? Shani mikarkoi denaidi mi mikarkoi delo naidi. That it's different when you have land that moves, meaning if the evid is considered like land, but the evid also moves, the evid can walk. That's different from land that does not move. And so even if an evid is like karka, you can give the same answer, because an evid is a unique kind of karka, and maybe it makes a difference whether the evid is on the property or the evid is not on the property. And the Gemara continues and explains why we would make that distinction, because again, avdim mekarkoi denied you, because avodim, they're a kind of land that moves around. Again, that's different. That's why the evid has to be on the actual property that the chazak is being made on. But over there, when you're talking about actual land, sadna diyara chadhu, so the land itself, it's all one, it's all connected, meaning actual pieces of land are all connected to one another. And so if you make a kinyan on a piece of land in one location, that automatically will be effective for the piece of land in another location. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Nechasim she'ein behen me'ila v'chulu, that the halacha that a person is responsible for damage it only applies if the damage is done to property where there is no me'ila, meaning to say if it's property where there is me'ila, where the property is hektish, so then the person is not responsible to pay for the damages. But the Gemara says, me'ila hu delespa, when we're talking about what you're responsible for, it's property where there's no me'ila. Hamikdash kachi, but it is possible that that property has some kind of kedusha, as long as there's no me'ila, so there's going to be a responsibility for the damages. And the Gemara says, ma'antana, if that's the case, who is the author of our Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, B'kodshim kalim. We can be talking about kodshim kalim, meaning kodshim kalim, for example, a carbon shlomim is considered kodshim kalim, so that has some sanctity, but it's not the same level of sanctity of saying that it has me'ila, and so therefore you would be responsible in a situation of damage to kodshim kalim. V'yaliv de Rabbi Yossi Aglili, our Mishnah would be following Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the Omar Mamun Bailam Hu. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that kodshim kalim is really considered to be the property of the owner. It's not considered to be the property, the mammon of hektish, and therefore, again, there is going to be responsibility in terms of damage. Rashi says, Me'ilahu de ba'inon de lo lahavibu ben hachasim sha'ani chayiv ben izakin, meaning there has to be a din of me'ila by the property, or there has to be no din of me'ila by the property where I am chayiv in terms of damages. Ha'ilesbu me'ila, but as long as there's no me'ila, afagav de mikdash kachi, even though there is some sanctity, ani chayiv ben izakin, I still will be chayiv in terms terms of the damages. Kagon kachim kalim she'ein bahen me'ila mechayim, for example. Kachim kalim, when the animal is alive, there is no me'ila over there. The only time there's me'ila by kachim kalim, let's say by a carbon shlomim, is only ela be'emurin la'achar zrikas dam. Let's say you have the emurim, which are the parts of the animal that are burned on the mizbeach after you've already sprinkled the blood. So already at that point, on the emurim, there's going to be me'ila. But while the animal is alive, there is no me'ila. Kedegarsinan me'meseches me'ila, as we learn in Meseches me'ila. And so therefore, again, when it comes to kachim kalim, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that it's mammon bailim, there is going to be a responsibility to pay. And the Gemara said, Man tana de mechaye ben izaken im hizik shoro, shor shlamim shel chaveiro. Who is this Tan of our Mishnah that says that you are chayav in damages? Let's say his shore damages the shore, which is a carbon shlamim of his friend. Again, that's the Tan of Yossi Aglili, who says, mammon bailim heim. He says that the kachim kalim is considered mammon bailim, v'shor reyehu karina bay. That's considered to be shor reyehu. That's considered to be the axe of his friend. And the Gemara continues the Tanya, as we learned in a brisa. Umala mal b'Hashem. It says in the pasuk umala mal b'Hashem l'rabos kachim kalim shehein mamono, that comes to include kachim kalim, which is considered to be his property. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. This is where you see that Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds that kachim kalim are considered to be mammon bailim. Rashi explains the context of the pasuk. We'll see the pasuk in full first. Nefesh kisechato mola mal b'Hashem v'kichesh ba'amiso b'pikadon o b'sasum esyaro b'gazel o ashek es amiso. It's talking about a person who denies, let's say, a deposit. He denies that he owes a deposit to somebody, and he falsely swears about it. That's umola mal b'Hashem. That's what we call shavuas hapikadon. So in such a situation, as Rashi over here says, umola mal b'Hashem v'kichesh ba'amiso gabe shavuas hapikadon ksiv. That's by shavuas hapikadon. And that's l'rabos kachim kalim, that comes to include kachim kalim, hadechsiv b'Hashem, meaning the fact that the pasuk says b'Hashem, l'rabos kachim kalim, it includes kachim kalim in this halacha of shvuas hapikadon. Meaning, what's the halacha? Shem hifgid behemas shalom emetzel chaveru. Let's say, for example, a person would deposit an animal that's a carbon shalom by his friend, the kafar v'nishba v'hoda, and then he goes ahead and he denies that he owes the animal. He takes an oath; it's a false oath, and he admits that he was lying. Mishalim keren v'chomash v'yasham. He has to pay the principal and the fifth, and he brings a carbon asham. V'yafagav devekadshe shamayim einish boin alim. Now, even though generally by kadshim you don't have such an oath, you don't take an oath. Kedegarsina in Perak Hazov, like we learn in Perak Hazov and Babba Metzia. But kadshim kalim nishboim. That's the exception over here. When it comes to kadshim kalim, you do take the oath, meaning to say it's an exception from other kinds of kadshim. And when it comes to kadshim kalim, they're treated just like any other object, any other pikadon, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, because they're considered to be mammon bailim. And the Gemara continues v'atanan, but we learned in a Mishnah, ha-mekadesh bechelko. Let's say a person is mekadesh. This is talking about kiddushin. He's mekadesh a woman. In terms of kiddushin, he's marrying a woman. Bechelko means to say with his portion. Bein bekadshe kachim, bein bekachim kalim. Whether we're talking about a carbon that is kadshe kachim, whether we're talking about a carbon that is kachim kalim, Eino mikudeshes. So it says in the Mishnah that it is not going to be a good kiddushin. The point over here is that the person is mekadesh a woman with some kind of a carbon. Doesn't matter what kind of carbon. Doesn't matter if it's kachim kachim, let's say like a carbon asham. Doesn't matter if it's kachim kalim, let's say like a carbon shlamim. And even if he's being mekadesh with his chelik, with his portion that he's really getting from the carbon, but still we say it's not a good kiddushin. So apparently it's not considered to be mammon bailim. And so the Gemara says lema to lo Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Let us say that this Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yossi Haglili. And the Gemara says, no, afilu teim or Rabbi Yossi Haglili. You could even say this Mishnah is Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Ki amar Rabbi Yossi Haglili mechayim. Because Rabbi Yossi Haglili, when he said that kachim kalim are considered to be mammon bailim, that's while the animal is still alive. But once already you've shechted the animal, even if it's a carbon shlamim, afilu Rabbi Yossi Haglili mod, even Rabbi Yossi Haglili admits, even though you're going to be eating some parts of that carbon, but Rabbi Yossi admits that the people who are eating are really eating off the table of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the Beis HaMikdash, so to speak. It's not really considered to be theirs. And Rashi explains, Ki Amar Rabbi Yossi Haglili mammon bailim have. When did Rabbi Yossi Haglili say that it's considered mammon bailim mechayim? That's when the animal's still alive. Why? What's the distinction? Shacharayis hualav, because the person's really responsible. If something would happen to that carbon, he'd have to bring another one. Avalachar shlita, but when it comes to already after the animal's been shechted, kizachu ben kohanim bechaz v'shok. Once they get the portions they're supposed to get, the kohanim, for example, get the chaza and the shok from a carbon. Ben bailim b'shar habasar, the bailim get the other meat from the carbon. Mishulchan Gavoa Zachu. They're really getting it from the table of the Almighty. It's not considered to be Mammon Bailim. But the Gemara continues, but when it's alive, does he really say that it's considered to be Mammon Bailim? But the Gemara says, but we learned in a Mishnah, Bechor, when it comes to a Bechor, when it comes to a firstborn, this is talking about a firstborn animal, Rashi will explain, Mochronoso Tam Chai, when you can sell the animal, let's say it's a tam, meaning it doesn't have any blemishes, you can sell it while it's alive, Ubalmum, but once the animal, the Bechor, has developed the blemish, so Chai v'shachet, so then already you can sell it while it's alive or after it's been shached. Umekadishin boes isha, and you're allowed to be mekadesh a woman. A kohen is allowed to be mekadesh a woman with this bechor. And the Gemara continues. V'yomer Rav Nachman Amar Rabba bar Avua. And Rav Nachman said that Rabba bar Avua said, Lo shanu ela bechor bizman hazeh. This is only true when it comes to a bechor nowadays. Why? The kaven de lo chazil hakrava, because since a bechor nowadays he can't bring as a carbon. So islahu lekohanim zechiyah begavayo. The kohanim are considered to have a zechiyah. They're considered to have an element of ownership over the animal. Avol bizman shebeis hamikdash kaim, but at the times of the Beis Hamikdash, the chazil hakrava, where it could be brought as a carbon, this bechor. So then no, they're not considered to have ownership. And on that halacha v'eitzvei Rav Rav Nachman. So when Rav Nachman said that, Rav asked Rav Nachman the following question: Umalo amal b'Hashem l'rabos kachim kalim shein memono. Divrei Rav Yossi Aglili. Rav Yossi Aglili says that we learn out from the pasuk of Umalo amal b'Hashem, as we said above, that kachim kalim is considered to be his money, and that's the same by a bechor. A bechor is kachim kalim, just like a carbon shlamim. So really, it should be considered like he is an owner. Umeshani Ravina, and Ravina answered, "Bechor bechutz la'aretz v'ali b'Rabbi Shimon." We're talking specifically about a bechor in chutz la'aretz, according to Rabbi Shimon. Only in that situation would we say that it's considered to be his money. The Amar im bo tamim im yikravu, because he says that if they come without blemish, then they can be brought on the mizbeach im bo in. But that means if they came, but lechatchila lo, but lechatchila that is not the case. And Rashi explains, Bechor mochrono so bizman hazeh. We're talking about a Bechor that the Bechor can be sold, and nowadays, kedemuki lo lekamon, v'akohanim mochron oso lekohen, like we're going to say later on, they can sell it to another Kohen. Tam chai, so let's say it has no blemishes, so then it can be sold while it's alive. V'lokeach yamten at sheyipo bo mum, and then what will happen is the person who buys it will wait for it to develop a mum, v'yishchetanu, and then he can shecht it. Avol tamim shachet lo, but let's say it was unblemished, and it was already shechted, it was slaughtered, then you can't. De'in lo takana lekavu, because there's nothing you can do with such an animal except for bury it. The aser bahana, it's considered to be prohibited to get any benefit from it. The kachim hashchutin b'chutzu, because it's basically kachim, it's like a carbon that was shechted outside of the area where it's supposed to be shechted, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, and so therefore again in that situation there's nothing you can do. Umekachin bo hakohanim, and then it said again that was talking about a bechor if it was a tam, so it can be sold while it's alive, but it cannot be sold while it's after it's shechted. A Baal Mum can be sold chai v'shachot, and then it said umekachin bo kohanim. Kohanim are considered to be able to do kiddushin with it. Umekachin bo kohanim esoisha, they can be mekadesh women. The mamonon hu, because it's considered to be their mammon. The bail of shel bechor hainu kohen. The kohen is the owner of the bechor. The mishanolar ha bechor shalohu, because once the animal is born, it belongs to the kohen. And again, then the Gemara said that on that Mishnah Rav Nachman said from Rabba bar Avua that this is specifically talking about a bechor bizman hazeh. Lo shanu de bechor chai have a mammon bailim kashutam ela bizman hazeh. When we say that a bechor that's alive is considered to belong to the owner, when it's unblemished, that's only bizman hazeh. Then we say zechiyah begavayu. So then we say that it's lo chazi la'akrava, you can't bring it as a carbon, so it's considered like the Kohanim have ownership over it, mechayim, while it's alive. But when the Beis HaMikdash is kayim, so then you can bring it as a carbon, so then they don't have that ownership. And then the Gemara said, Ve'esvei Garsin, and Rava then asked Rav Nachman the following question. Again, Rav Nachman was bringing from Rav Yossi Aglili, the Kachim Kalim Ar Memono, Shein Memono, Afilu Bizman Shebeis HaMikdash Kayim. The question is that statement, according to Rav Yossi Aglili, was not only when there's no Beis HaMikdash, even when there is a Beis HaMikdash, we say that Kachim Kalim is Memono. The Pasuk is talking about when there was a Beis HaMikdash by Shavuos HaPikodim. The Mechayev Le'ashim, the whole point of that Pasuk is saying you have to bring a carbon Asham. And so on that contradiction, Umeshani Ravina answered that contradiction by saying we're talking specifically about a Bechor Bechutz La'aretz, meaning Hacha de Katani b'Mammon Bailim. Hey, when we say that it's Mammon Bailim, when we say the Kachim Kalim are considered to belong to the owners, that's B'Vechor Hanoled Bechutz La'aretz. That's specifically talking about a bechor that's born in Chutz La'aretz Bizman HaMikdash Askinan, during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, but it's in Chutz La'aretz. The lo koil hakrav. In that case, it's not considered to be set to be brought on the mizbeach. The aliba de Rabbi Shimon Damer, that follows Rabbi Shimon's shita, who says the Meseches Tmura. He says in Meseches Tmura in general about bechoros and Chutz La'aretz, im bo bechoros me Chutz La'aretz L'Eretz Yisrael. If bechoros come, meaning after the fact, they come from Chutz La'aretz to Eretz Yisrael, so tamimim, and they're unblemished, yikruvu, then they're brought on the mizbeach. Bo in lechatchila lo. It's only if they came already to Eretz Yisrael, otherwise not. Ela yiru ad sheyastov. If they don't come to Eretz Yisrael, you let them graze and you let them develop a blemish. Ve'elkach came in the lav l'hakrava koi. So those are not considered l'hakrava. Have a mammon kohen. That's considered to be mammon. It's considered to belong to the kohen. And that was the contradiction. That was the answer to the contradiction that Ravina gave. Ravina said when Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says that kachim kalim are mamono, that would include bechor. That's specifically in Chutz La'aretz. That follows the shita of Rabbi Shimon. That wouldn't apply to bechor in Eretz Yisrael. And so now the Gemara concludes its question. V'im isa. Now, if it is really true, Rashi explains, V'im isa demechayim amar Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. If it's true that Rabbi Yossi HaGalili was talking when the animal was alive, to mammon bailam him, and saying it's considered to be mammon bailam when the animal is alive, kedekatani masnisin dechayav al nizkan, which is what we're saying. We're saying that you're chayav on any damage that is done. That sounds like when the animal is alive we're talking about. V'ukimnak Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. We said it's like Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, so Rabbi Yossi HaGalili says it's considered mamono mechayim. If that's really true, Techiyam Rabbi Yossi HaGalili mamono hu mechayim. That when Rabbi Yossi HaGalili said it's considered to be his property, it's when the animal is alive. So then we should have suggested a different answer, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.